And interestingly enough, since we started working with the spirit medicine, uh, we, and especially for me, I started attracting more and more people with borderline personality disorder, and in my field. And I realized eventually that the reason is because I already had that mind and knowledge base and mind structure in a way that developed around the academic knowledge, expertise, all of that, which inevitably kind of gives birth to some kind of intuition and sixth sense about um, when I see a client, I can tell immediately whether they have borderline personality disorder or trait or intense highly pronounced traits. We all have some traits that are not healthy, whether they're narcissistic, borderline, schizoid, whatever they are. And we all have, most of us have all of them to some extent, right? It's just a question of what's more pronounced. And then there's a disorder which is on another end of the spectrum. And what we started noticing is that, and I'm now kind of trying to do a small research, is that how the medicine affects people with, particularly with borderline and narcissistic personality disorders, that most often they benefit seemingly initially. They go deep into healing the childhood wounds, they soften, the defenses are softened, their hearts are open, they're loving, they're forgiving, the opposite of what they normally are.
Accountable.
They're normally vindictive and
Very accountable.
and projecting, and so they're accountable, the opposite of projecting. They're not vindictive, they're forgiving. They're all of that. It's beautiful. But then somewhere between a couple of days and couple of weeks, what happens is boom, they go back and they become worse. And we noticed that as a pattern. This is not obviously a research that could be published because it's just our observation. But I really want to be both, but especially me, I really want to kind of research this further because I'm curious about how can we then help people with those very, very pronounced traits with the disorder. Like, how can we sustain this? Because I saw like it, how if we could sustain those first 2 days, 2 weeks, whatever it is, that would be amazing. But unfortunately, we it's nobody has ever we have never seen it sustained yet fully. Well, that's not true. We have, but I'll tell you later about how, because we kind of started figuring it out. What seems to us that happens is that once those defenses are melted and they actually experience full compassion and
being present
and accountability, as Ivan said, and all of that, and they're not perceiving themselves as victims anymore, and they actually become accountable for what they've done, and they feel and they kind of feel remorseful for that. What happens is, it seems to happen that because those wounds and that the ego structure is so deep, because those wounds are so severe, that the ego starts freaking out. They feel like defenseless, and it's almost like a snail without a house, right? And as the medicine starts exiting the body and loosening its physiological potency, the ego starts rebuilding itself fast, because it's me against the world. And then it rebuilds itself stronger because they had experienced vulnerability, true authentic vulnerability, for the first time since before the wounds happened, which they happen at very early stage. Narcissistic and borderline wounds both happen before 3 years.
Can you explain
primarily.
Difference between different traces of borderline personality?
Okay.
Because
Different.
it
Yeah.
would be really good to understand.
Okay, maybe just briefly. I don't want this to be a lecture about borderline personality. There are lots of different types, and not all borderline personality disorders look the same. Some are very openly mean, aggressive, attacking, vindictive, kind of aggressive, loud in their self defenses. They perceive. Some are the opposite. Sorry, some are the opposite.
Yeah.
Very quiet and and seemingly very nice, and can even be seemingly people pleasing, especially in the early stages of whatever relationships, friendships, whatever it is. But they have extremely harsh self talk inside, very, very harsh, very hostile inside. So some are hostile on the outside, some are hostile only on the inside. But even those who are hostile only in the inside and seemingly very nice and people pleasing and pleasant, when they are pushed to the limit, and it doesn't have to be anything big, it's just in their own projections, because the reality assessment is not very good. They don't perceive things with the rational mind but with the emotions. So if I'm upset because after you said something, that means you meant to hurt me. It like that's the kind of thinking, while a person without the disorder will realize, oh, this is upsetting for me, but that doesn't mean necessarily that they meant to offend me or that they were even addressing me, uh, you know. So when something triggers them beyond their capacity to hide and contain that hostility inside and that anger inside, then they'll explode un- like unpredictably and shockingly to people who don't know them. And there are all kinds of stages and variations in between, which I don't want to go into. But similar things happen to narcissistic personality disorder. I remember reading years ago that narcissists should not journey with ayahuasca because it makes them more narcissistic, and I was curious about that. And now I think it's not ayahuasca; it's any plant. Spirit medicine doesn't have to be plant that reconnects you with your soul, that lowers your defense or shatters your defenses, that brings you back to your authentic self, which is always vulnerable, right? And I think it's again the same, the fear of vulnerability, because what is narcissism as well? It's just an extreme defense against vulnerability, because vulnerability was so unsafe when they were growing up because of the combination, in my opinion, of the person's what the person brings into the world, whatever our our predisposition to be a certain kind of personalities, depending on the brain, what do you call it, configurations, and the environment. That combination is what produces. So it's not, most people now believe it's just environment, it's just trauma. Like a lot depends on what we bring also, on our karmic uh, um, lessons that we are supposed to have, and our genetic predispositions and all of that. It's always a combination of lots of things, including other environmental factors, not just emotional and social, but physical, physiological. Eric and I had amazing insights about in one of our sessions about parasites, and how the 3D parasites open a portal to spiritual parasites. Only Ivan told me, I wrote that in my book 20 years ago. It's like, oh, really? I don't remember.
Thank you. But people are waking up to the knowledge.
But it was our insight, and we kind of in a different way too.
That's
So
perfect.
it's all kind of getting, uh, bringing pieces, putting pieces of the puzzle together, right? So again, it's this very similar process. So what we concluded is that for people with the extreme wounds that resulted in those disorders, I mean, we have, sorry, I'm going to interrupt myself. We have seen people with extreme wounds with severe PTSD, right? Well, one of our clients who came to several of our ceremonies, who was in a war and saw his friends being killed and grappled with terrible addiction since age of 11. Um, and it worked beautifully for him. But not everyone develops a personality disorder or even psychosis. Some people because of trauma, again, because it's a combination of many factors, right? And but those who do develop the disorders, personality disorders, what we believe works for them is We believe that the medicine journey can still work, but it has to be followed by intense psychotherapy, intense, so that, and by the therapist who obviously understands the medicine work, so that those defenses are not allowed to reconfigure themselves back, so that the therapist would constantly be bringing into the awareness what's happening and how the defenses are trying to rebuild themselves to keep the person in that state. And we think that could be it, actually, the healing method, because so far it's still considered that there's no cure. I mean, there's a dialectic behavioral therapy that's prescribed for people with borderline disorders, but they only really work on the surface level. There's no it's good. It's in a way teaching the person to view themselves differently, with a little bit more objectivity, which they lack in general. But it still doesn't hit, definitely.